I'm going for it. Hi, everybody. Hello. How are you? Good. How are you? I'm Megan. I work here at the library. I guess I'm going to do some housekeeping type stuff. You want me to do that first? Okay. So there's popcorn in the back. There's a lot of popcorn. Feel free to help yourselves. The other thing is, what else? If you have a cell phone, if you could turn it off or put it on vibrate or silent, I'm sure you have a great ringtone, but we probably don't want to hear it. And the other thing I always mention, if you've been to programs before with me, you probably are sick of death of me saying this, but the library closes the back door at 7:55. So if for some reason you need to go back to your car and come back in, find me or find a buddy who can let you back inside. Otherwise, you might be walking yourself out of the library. I've had people leave keys in here. It's not good. So I'm going to hand it over.
We've had people sleep in here.
You've had people sleep in here? Overnight?
We didn't know.
Oh, yeah. That would be really interesting. Whoa. Okay. Hold on. I'm going to move this a little bit. Or Bruce can turn it down. Oh, yeah. Is that better? Yeah. Alrighty. So,
That's it. I'm ready. Yeah.
okay, so I'm going to hand it off to Bruce because you didn't come here to tell me how to hear me talk. So, yeah, Bruce.
Equally, you didn't come to hear me talk either, although you're going to get it anyway. Welcome to City Salon. This is our big living room that's kind of, on steroids. Here we are. We have an incredible event tonight in the sense that we're hosting a national, if not international, treasure that lives right here in our community. And that's Mr. Trevor Fairbrother. So let's give him a hand first, because he's going to need it. And I've actually kind of seen some of the show, and you're in for a wonderful treat. And the context of which is that this City Salon, after 20 years, which is mind-bending, is a continuum. And last week we opened up with the first films of cinema, or some of the first films of cinema, the films by Auguste and Louis Lumiere, which are, for simply stated, the camera set up watching life happen in front of it. But the years are 1896 to 1905, so we're seeing this displaced time period. And tonight we're making, I don't know, like a 70-year jump and almost seeing the same thing again, but through Andy Warhol's eyes and how he set his camera up. And the continuum goes throughout the whole series. Now, I wasn't really totally aware of what was going on when I put the series together, which there's four different programs, let alone the online business that you can pick up and back that explain where we're going. But next week, we have the wonderful pleasure of another great national treasure showing up, who's local too, and that's Virginia Heffernan, who's going to be introducing and talking about her book, Magic and Loss, the Internet as Art. Ultimately, we get to a place where we're going to have a 20-year party on October 24th called the Hip Pip Dip Film Clip Party. City Salon at 20. And the wonder of that, besides the 20 years and doing this, which is just completely contrary to almost everything we all know today, or even 20 years ago for that matter, is that David Thompson, the film critic David Thompson, is going to appear somehow. We're not sure whether he's going to physically be here or be Skyped in. But I did a show with him on Miami Beach last weekend before last, on a film that we've restored that he showed when he was a professor here at Dartmouth in 1978. It was a one-shot deal where he took the film The Clock, that stars Judy Garland, split it in half, and projected it on projectors like you see in the back of the room simultaneously, forwards and backwards, to play with time. He has the most insightful comments about what cinema is. And this comes back to my continuum, which is cinema is always happening there, and there is in here. So we have Humphrey Bogart always there. We're going to have various people like Rufus Collins and who not do we see tonight there, always doing what they're doing. That is one of the great things of cinema. This is something David has been talking about for decades, Thompson, and I just wanted to point that out. The last thing I want to say, which is fascinating, I was talking to Ted Degninger, who runs Folk, the store down the street, who's been around here for a long time. I think as long as I have, maybe longer. Longer for sure. And when he heard, I asked him to hang the Warhol poster in his door, and he goes, "Oh yeah, I remember, that was really great. You were showing those films years ago, weren't you?" And I go, "Well, yeah, we did, but not the way he was describing it to me." And then I realized what he was describing was shows that I was doing in Burlington, Vermont, at the Real Surreal Film Festival in '84. And that was, we showed Andy Warhol's The Chelsea Girls. We might have shown Vinyl too, but anyway, the point was we had one of the actors who you'll see tonight, Ondine, Robert Olivo. He came and visited because he was the only way you could get these films back then. So Andy put them away. Trevor will tell you all about this. But you could only get these films if Ondine showed up with them. And so I'm like, blah, 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 you know, doing my boastful stuff. And he goes, no, it was over at Rosie Cheeks, over in the Grange. And I went, holy shit. You mean, yes, yeah, when Shadowbox was here, Ondine was one of the guests. And the proof of that was, I said, well, yeah, are you sure? And he goes, yeah, all the old ladies, they loved him. That was it. Ondine could jump both worlds. It could be Andy's outrageousness, he could, you know, warm the pants off you, so to speak. So with that done, these there, enjoy the show. There's no time limit to this tonight, in the sense of if you leave, for whatever reason, whether you got to run, you want to go see Trump, you're bored, you're outraged, that's all okay. So the outrage is kind of deflated by this. You can't be outraged tonight because it's okay to be outraged. So with all that done, Trevor Fairbrother, let's give him a warm thank
you. I was also going to say it's okay to leave whenever you'd like, and it's also okay to come and go get a drink and come back, because that's kind of how it was in the 60s when these movies were first shown. Let me also thank Bruce. What an amazing asset he is to this community. Mind-blowing that he can pull all of these sponsorships and relationships. Yeah. How do I make my transition?
You walk.
What about this?
You can walk with it.
Is it working? Do I need to do anything?
Nope.
Okay.
Oh.
I don't get clipped to it or anything?
No, it's just a piece of work.
So what I have, I have a PowerPoint to introduce the evening. And
oh, wait a minute, I can turn the projector on. A couple of buttons we have to push. You also talk for a minute, Trevor. It'll take 1 to 2 minutes.
I have to talk into this?
Yeah.
Okay.
But go ahead, because it's going to take 2
Okay.
minutes.
Yeah, it's going to take a minute.
I have to improvise. So you're seeing two movies tonight. One is 40 minutes long. The other is 52 minutes long. I'm going to do a PowerPoint introduction to the first. We're going to have a break. Bruce and I are going to chat. And then I have a very short PowerPoint introduction to the second movie. And
Okay, you're good.
here's our guy. And if you could kill the light right up there, that would be nice. Hooray. So here's Andy Warhol. I decided to focus on, as much as possible, on the year 1964 as a way of presenting the artist in these movies. And everything you're seeing tonight is filmed either in 1964 or 65. I would say 80% of it from 1964. And I'm going to begin with my own silent visual presentation and show you, just to get you in the historical time and place, a bunch of pictures from 1964 that I got from the internet for the most part. She'll be in one of our movies later tonight. She's Jane Holzer.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's 1964. A lot of the images and events Warhol certainly would have known. 1964 was a year, end of 63, he moved into a new studio, which was an industrial space on the 4th floor of a warehouse building in Midtown. And by the time he was done, he and his crazy friends had pretty much covered every surface, either painted it or covered objects with silver foil. He liked to call his studio the factory, and that was perfect for him because he had as strong a work ethic as anyone ever, I would argue. He was an incredibly driven, hard-working person. So he called his studio the factory, and this studio is now called the Silver Factory for that reason. I want to show you three people that Andy Warhol was in 1964. He was, he never stopped. He was an incredibly complicated person. He was a working class kid from Pittsburgh. He grew up Catholic. He was shy. He was gay. And he was very talented as an artist. He came to New York, I think in 1949. So he spent the whole decade of the 50s rising through the ranks as an illustrator and, say, commercial artist. The image on the right is an ad that he did for Martini, and that was still running in 62, 63, I think. But he was first known as a commercial artist, which in the world of fine art is not an artist at all. And he was especially known for his work for I. Miller, the shoe firm. and he did lots of album covers, and his style at that point was an ink style, but he had this thing called the blotted line technique. So he would make a drawing and then blot it with ink, and the blotted, the more imperfect, lumpy version would be the image that he would use for his ads. It was very distinctive. And as I say, he was a gay guy, and at that point, that was an illegal thing to be, but there was a subculture, and he was hanging out with these people, these three men who ran a cafe called Serendipity 3. And he was trying to make art, and for instance, this is a book that he made called A Gold Book. And there were beautiful drawings in this style, but it clearly was a book intended primarily, but not exclusively, but for a gay male audience, because there were very attractive drawings of man, this kind of James Dean type guy on the cover. But in 1961, he decided enough of this commercial thing. I also want to be a real, he already was an artist, but he wanted to be a fine artist. And he became what we now know in 1962, Andy Warhol, the man who painted soup cans, and still problematic or difficult to understand for a lot of people. But they are, it was a generational reaction against abstract painting and an embrace of the real world. And the fact that Warhol was in and still active in advertising made him perfect fit to move in this direction. So these are paintings from '62, when he became center of the discussion about pop art, and was it the end of the world or an amazing new thing. Here he is in '64. At the bottom, part of his exhibition, these were paintings on wooden boxes, but they look like cardboard boxes in which food is shipped. So he had a whole room of these Campbell's tomato soup boxes. All of this stuff he makes, they are made by hand, but they're actually made with a silk screen. So you see him on the top left with his assistant using a silk screen stencil to apply these colors one at a time to these boxes. There you see him doing a silk screen of a giant photograph of a flower. He did a series of flowers in 1964. You can see the amount of work that you have to do to press that squeegee thing which pushes the ink through the silkscreen stencil. And the silkscreen stencils are based on photographs, which also became very important to him because it allowed him to make people think he wasn't really an artist at all, because he was using silk screens they weren't really paintings, they were prints, and he didn't really draw the stuff because he was using photographs. So he knew very well how to make art that freaked people out and made them wonder if it was art at all. But obviously he made a hit with the avant-garde art world. There you see him in his studio with his couple of his assistants, and you see that these flower paintings came in all sizes and all colors, and that is the so-called Silver Factory. His approach to making portraits, and that became important to him as a source of money when he found success as a painter and a pop artist, was to again use photographs. So when he got people to commission a painting from him, this is an important early example, Ethel Scull, a collector. He took her to the photo booth, the automatic photomat I think in Grand Central Station, and they just took dozens and dozens of photographs of her clowning for the camera or just being herself, having fun, and then he used those photographs as the basis for individual paintings, which are then ganged together as one large portrait. So you see her as he says, 36 times, and in a sense, it's an impression of, it's not like one definitive Ethel, it's like the many faces of Ethel changing in front of you. 1963 was also the year he became a cinema artist. So here's the third Warhol, the commercial artist, the pop artist, and the film artist. This is the first film that was shown publicly in 1964. It ran over 5 hours, and it's called Sleep. And it's images of this man who had been a lover of Warhol's asleep at night. He stretches out the film to 5 hours by repeating various sections and looping them over. But it's it was a provocative beginning, 5 hours of one guy sleeping naked. And the same year, 64, it was a 39-minute film of one man eating one mushroom as slowly as possible. That was the directive. Just eat one mushroom, but make it last. The other notorious film at this time was a film of the Empire State Building from dusk until dawn. And that was a continuous footage film called Empire. The other thing that he's doing in 64, and this is the films we're about to see, this new venture that he called Screen Tests. They were film portraits, and because he had this new studio and he'd been making films for about a year, he had this idea that anyone interesting came through the door, he would say, "Oh, quick, let me make a picture of you," and make a portrait of you, which was a film portrait. And when he made these, initially, at the very beginning, he would say to the people, just pretend you're in a photograph, remain very still, and try not to blink. So, starting in 64, he made 500 of these with at least 189 people, and he stopped doing it in 66. Now, what he did was to use a single 100-foot roll of film, and it took about 3 minutes for the film to run through the camera. And when he showed them, he had them projected at a slower speed so that each takes about 4 minutes. There he is with his camera and some boxes of film at his feet. One of the cliches is that he didn't even do these, or he would turn on the camera and walk away, which is probably true some, if not quite a lot of the time. But that sort of created a myth that this whole thing was kind of a joke and he wasn't really taking it seriously. But in fact, he had designed this whole ritual and this way of making a film, and he knew how it worked. So the point was, once you had found your subject, you'd gotten them sat down, you put them under the glare of the spotlight, and you turned the camera on, then you let them be themselves for three minutes. And tons of people, famous and emerging musicians, poets, writers, socialites, a famous, wonderful drag queen at the bottom there, Mario Montez, did I say dancers, movie people, appear in these films. Bruce mentioned the Lumiere films from last week. I was just blown away by that program. And when I was watching it, I got worried about this program because I thought, the program had this beautiful French soundtrack. I think it was Ravel, but I'm not sure. Sanson. Yeah, so a fantastic soundtrack, silent movies, all very, very short. And I thought, the program next week is going to seem so kind of cold and difficult compared with that. But as a way of trying to interest you in how to look at these films, here's a comparison. Now, in the Lumiere film on the right, which is one of my favorites, again, it's a static camera, like Warhol. And what I loved about that film was that the composition was just so carefully thought out. And if you look at it in terms of bands, horizontal bands working up, so at the bottom you have a band of the river, and you have these beautiful out of focus reflections. Then the next band are these working women, working class women washing clothes at the river. Then you have a band of the building where their workplace, the factory, if you will. And then above it you have a band where the banks of the river, where people are standing around. And then at the very top there's a band which is a street. And so while you're watching this very short movie, you get to see people moving back across this. You see the cart go across the top, you see the river flickering away. So these compositions are not as complicated as the Lumiere one you're seeing on the right. But I think Warhol's point is, once you start looking and once you start being drawn into the film, you start finding things for your eye and your mind to start getting caught up in. And they were portraits, they were living portraits, and we think of portraits as static, and so I'm comparing here a Warhol screen test with the amazing Dürer self-portrait, which, you know, Andy Warhol would adore that picture because it's this sexy man showing his chest, and he has beautiful blonde hair and a very fetching face. So in a way, I think Warhol is updating that kind of portrait by, instead of it being a static, frozen image, it's a living image. And it's also very timely. These are two screen tests you're going to see, but I'm comparing it, for example, with these photographs of the Beatles, their first American album released in '64, where you have this very strong contrast of light on the faces, making them very sculptural and giving this kind of visual interest to them. Warhol's aesthetic with all of these things was to basically to not worry about being perfect. He liked accidents. There's a quote from '66 where he says, "Show the most scratches you can on the film, or all the dirt you can get on the film, so everyone knows you're watching a film." So what you're about to see in all of these films, the camera is static, it's just one take, it's silent, it's slowed down, it's very, very spare, but all of those things add up to choices on the artist's part. And this is just, we can talk about it afterwards, but these are the people that you're going to see tonight. It begins with the actress Brooke Haywood, whose husband is Dennis Hopper, and but most of them are just kids, emerging actors, poets, people hanging around the factory. And the films that you're seeing tonight, this isn't something that Warhol put together, this particular group. It's just an accident. This is just how they ended up this way on the Museum of Modern Art's screen loop. So that's it for now.
Great. Thank you.
This is not the Mickey Mouse Club. This is Cine Salon. Yes.
Can we sing the song now?
The Hood Art Museum gave us the money to rent these films from the Museum of Modern Art, so thank you, Hood Art Museum. But back to Andy Warhol. I was, as a kid in the middle of nowhere in England, at my local library, I would look at the books on art, and that was my introduction to, there was a book on pop art, which I probably saw maybe when I was 16 or something, and for some reason, Andy Warhol's work and his name captured me, and I guess 20 years later, I had been I was a graduate student at Boston University, and then I joined the staff of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And I was actually, my dissertation was on John Singer Sargent, but there was this funny moment where my boss became acting head of contemporary art while they looked for a new curator. And so I said, if you really want to shake up Boston, they don't have an Andy Warhol. They've always avoided things like pop art, the MFA. Let's get an Andy Warhol. And he said, fine, find me one. So, and as to zip to the end of the story, that process, I got to meet Andy Warhol, and it was an amazing privilege. I loved it. I found him, a lot of people would say he was a monster, or he was difficult, but of course I was the client in a sense. We were buying from him, so he was always nice to me, and he let me interview him about John Singer Sargent, and the Whitney had an exhibition, and that was a lot of fun. So fun to do.
This is what year? The first contact is what year?
84, I think.
84. So he was in the upscale factory by then.
Yeah.
Down by Union Square.
Yeah, the first time I went, I saw the Union Square factory just before they emptied it out, and I guess what he was working on then was a series of prints called the Ads. So this is quite late, and he died in '87, but there were ads of pop art prints of advertisements, some of them historic. Like there's one with Ronald Reagan on a television ad, but there was also the ad for Apple computers. So,
yeah, what was fascinating is I don't know the year, I got there eventually somehow, and what was fascinating was by then it was all upscale, right? So when you came up this freight elevator, which was kind of funky, but then it opened the door into a little alcove where one of the Great Danes that was stuffed standing there looking at you, and then you entered these big doors into a typical Manhattan-like office scenario. And when I went, it was to be interviewed for a job, not to be interviewed for a job. So they said, okay, you got to get in the hall and stand in the office over there. So I go down this hall and walk in this room, and it's a completely barren, stripped, factory room with a broken toilet sitting in the middle of the room, and that was the chair that I was interviewed on. So the contrast were quite great. But you had your portrait done by Andy at some point, correct?
Yeah, I did. I wasn't quite sure. I didn't commission it. He took some Polaroids of me at what was the last factory, the last studio, and it was after I'd done the interview at the Whitney at the Sargent show. And he said, I want to take some snapshots of you, and he did, and then the next time I was there, he gave me a drawing, so obviously he was pleased with the way the interview had gone, and
that's wonderful.
It was very sweet.
Yeah, yeah. Which leads us back to the films, the portraits. Yeah. It was great that we had the PowerPoint first with the digital imagery, which has a certain brilliance and luminance to it, to be followed by the real object itself, being the films. They're not films on video, they're the film as one would have seen it years ago, and probably about the same size even, maybe bigger, maybe smaller. But the one difference technically was ours was a little bit faster. Ours was at 18 frames a second as opposed to 16, which would have been there were even more flicker and a little bit longer duration. But what struck me at a certain point was, and I think it's when John Giornio came on, the white man in profile, it was just mind-blowing. The whole thing was mind-blowing. Yeah. But then this elegance that became timeless, not because it was going slow, but because it was this beauty that you were seeing, this illumination that reflected not only in the lighting, but the 16mm film in the way we produced an image.
Yeah, I think one of the, I haven't seen any of the movies we're seeing tonight, neither has Bruce. And when there are 28
excuse me, that was our curatorial decision not to intervene and watch what we're going to show you.
there are 28 reels of these screen tests available from the modern, and the organization is completely random, which is very strange. I mean, you could decide which reel you want to borrow. I wanted to borrow one that had mostly early ones, and also to have a crossover with the movie we're about to see. So there's a guy whose nickname is Binghamton Birdie. He appeared twice in this, and you'll see him doing various antics in the next movie. And also the black guy, Rufus Collins. And that's actually the only African-American man in the Warhol screen test. So I thought it would be great to see him in two different contexts. But I think what came across is, even though it's sort of like a crap shot, which films are on the reel, given this random selection, it still had Warhol's artistry, and the incredible variation. They're all basic decisions, but when you see one after another, it's like, well, does it have a white background? Does it have a black background? Is the film really close up on the head, or does the guy have a sexy neck, and are we getting to see the neck? And are the lights very close, and how strong and dark is it? How dark? I loved. Part of me wanted to start yelling out comments, but there's also there's like the communal thing of watching, because I do think there's something mystical about watching these things. I think Warhol knew that they had this kind of, they could induce a kind of reverie, and that they're very intimate, and so seeing them all together quietly adds to that intimacy. But there's this one moment.
The quietness tonight was actually quite wonderful. I'm not sure why everyone was quiet, but it was very, very nice. At least for me, to watch them without the interference of. I mean, it was great at the beginning, the popcorn noises, everybody munching away, and then that subsided, and it kind of went ethereal with it. Also, when I got the screen from Rich, because I wasn't sure how to pull this off in this space because of the changes. When I realized I could put it up above the drop ceiling so we could look up as opposed to look straight across, I thought, oh, this is kind of reverent too. It'll give it a more icon feeling.
One that I loved, when first time I almost yelled out, was when there was, about halfway through, there was a guy, suddenly his head was slightly turned, but one ear was brightly illuminated and the other was a black silhouette. And that was sort of like, whoa, look at, that's because none of the others had that. And then various of them had part of the face in deep shade, but there was one like next to the end that was very deep shade, except you could really see his eye. I mean, there was like light coming out, even though the eye was in darkness, and then occasionally he would blink, and there would be a touch more light when he blinked. So, again, these are, in a sense, minuscule events, but in the context of watching them and adoring them.
The other thing was, for me, was the silence, in the sense of if any of you seen Warhol films that have sound? Oh, one person, two. Okay, like Chelsea Girls is a great example for this, or later when he did the TV shows. There was a guy near the end, Charles Rydell, a big blocked guy. He later starred in a bunch of TV shows that Warhol was making. I can't remember the name of the one. It's really great. But he's a lot heavier. He's come loose a little bit with age and whatnot. So that firmness was gone. But he's completely ranting like crazy, which you don't hear any sound at all. So it's totally different. And the same thing, John Giorno. I just saw him a couple months ago, and he's wonderful. The man that's in Sleep and was early on in the films, and his voice is wonderful too. So it was great to hear. Not here. A displacement of cinema. The one thing that people have trouble with, I think, with these films is they're not films. They're not movies per se. Did anybody have that reaction tonight? Like, where's the action? Where's the story? where we're going? No? Okay. Yes. Okay. You did, Phyllis. Yeah, exactly, because you're a movie person. And I thought that was an interesting.
Or if I knew who it was, maybe. If I knew who the person was.
You had a personal connect somehow.
Well, just the name or something. I knew who I was watching.
Oh, that would help you in the
Yeah,
sense of
without me focus on watching.
Yeah, yeah.
Something else I knew.
Citizens.
Right, but that's beyond what it is, so it's hard to say that about it, because that's not the enterprise. What I was going to lead to, though, is that the word film, movie, cinema, avant-garde, experimental, whatever you throw out here, or even the word art, all becomes problematic and in question with these, or all of his work in film, or any other artist. Example being, what I'm trying to get at here is somebody like Joseph Cornell, who did something else, and then all of a sudden was making movies, and those movies are astounding within the something else that he did. Or these, Bill Viola, another example, somebody that ripped off this. So yeah, they're movies, of course, but how does that expand our notion of art and movies?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, I have to thank Bruce. This is the most fun and interesting project I've done since moving here 4 years ago. I really had such pleasure figuring out what I wanted to say to introduce a general audience. And one of the things I've realized is how Warhol, I mean, he's, I think, a natural with a camera, or a natural maker of pictures. But I think he went to movies because underground cinema was like the most happening thing in New York. I mean, it had started in the mid-50s and was growing and growing and growing. And as I tried to say about Warhol, he was an artist who had to have a day job, and he was a commercial illustrator, and he did incredibly well at it and became very wealthy. And he sort of ripped through that field. But then it's like, no, I want to be a real artist as well. But then also I think he thought, well, there's all this film stuff going on. I want to be one of those too. And I think he was very good at just saying, I want to be that as well. And he was confident enough. And I think part of that, the ambience of the whole thing was, because it's also the 60s, it's like, let's be experimental, let's do anything, let's do everything, let's try this, let's try that. And also let's learn the history of film, which is what Bruce does. So there's a lot of revisiting.
Well, the revisiting, you should talk about that, because that is part and parcel of what this is. The years that Warhol made films was 63-ish through his death, so to speak. Kind of, sort of, kind of. And what that means is that as an artist, he progressed radically through the years. So there's stages of the filmmaking where he went from one thing to the next thing to the next thing. And it was always somehow tied into him finding another piece of equipment. So he was really facile, or could facilitate using a machine. So this machine's a little camera that at first you had to wind it up and it would run 30 seconds. But then you could put a motor on the side of it so it could run the 3 minutes that we saw now. Eventually, after doing hundreds of these, like you say, he found a camera which recorded sound on film, which was a news camera at the time called an Oricon, and it would do 20, I think even to 40-minute loads of film. And I'm not sure if in Couch we're going to be getting that. I'm not sure if it's the 3-minute rolls put together or the longer, but it's still silent. These other ones with good sound. Then this camera also had a thing called a 12 to 120 ingenue zoom lens, which means he could start zooming. And if you explore all these Warhol films of that period, about 66 to 68 or so, there's an incredible amount of nauseating and wonderful zooming that goes on, exploring the set, whatever that might be, let alone all the lighting that we've seen. And eventually color enters the picture. There's only a couple of color screen tests. Anyway, the point of all my blah, 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 and eventually got tied up with people trying to make narrative movies with stories of sorts. And eventually with things like 3D movies like Frankenstein and Dracula, that maybe some of you remember, where these horrible things would come out at you in 3D with the old glasses. But anyway, what happened is this, is he was, like Trevor said, was funding the whole enterprise by his painting and selling all this stuff. The movies made nothing, zero. Nobody saw these movies. They only heard about them, really, because you'd go in for 5 minutes and you'd leave, right? So it was Andy did it, you go see it. He eventually got discouraged as he went through each of these phases, because ultimately, in many respects, he wanted to be as famous for his films like he was for his paintings, or for the Hollywood films that he was endeared of. So at some point, which I think comes after he was shot, pretty much, that period, which is what, 68? 68. he'd put everything away. Put it all away. These things, the screen tests, were put away. Dead storage. And they did not revive until after he passed away, and the estates all fought with each other and worked everything out. And about 5 different groups kind of own these films and oversee them now. It is probably the largest film project by any single artist of all time, except maybe MGM, Paramount, you know, the studio's proper. But those are all different artists. This is just one person. It's huge, the amount of footage involved. The people overseeing it now, which is the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of Art, the Andy Warhol Foundation, and the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, I think that covers everybody, has underwritten this in various forms to keep it going. Oh, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Arts is that other group. And that's why we have the copies we have now and we can rent them. But there are hundreds and hundreds of reels of film. They were telling me at the Andy Warhol Foundation a couple weeks ago, I was talking with them about something, and they said that they found in this stuff, because they're doing a full detailed catalog now, which has never been done, they found 50 rolls of unprocessed film. Wow. They've been sitting since the 63 to 68 period, and they don't know what to do. Do we process them? Do we leave them alone? This is just simply, it's mind-boggling that not only did he do it, that it sat in his house or wherever it sat, and then that somebody's taking care of it now that we could have it here, even in this little bit that we're showing at Cine Salon. It's wacko, yeah.
I think one of the cliches that as a kid, I mean, as an undergraduate, I got to see some Warhol movies, and I was a science major, and but really wanted to be involved in art, and they were very important to me. Just I didn't understand necessarily much of anything, and this was England and not America, you know. But I did see Chelsea Girls, and you know, it just sort of blew my mind. But one of the things that I read about Warhol, which I think is more like a PR thing that he probably helped foster at the time, and Lord knows he was good at that. You know, there was always a new myth that he was putting out to the world. But one of the things people used to say about his movies was Andy Warhol is recreating the history of cinema. So his first movies were silent and the camera didn't move. And they were just a shot, the Empire State Building, somebody's head. And then eventually he decides to add sound, and then he eventually decides to move the camera or play with the lens. And that really impressed me at the time as a scientist. It's sort of like, you know, he's reliving the evolution of film. But I think it was more like, as Bruce said, he just, like when he could afford to get a camera with sound, and when he got a camera with sound, he started doing sound movies. And I think
and if something didn't appeal to him or to work out for whatever reason, whether it's the people, the camera movement, the processing, he'd just put the thing aside and move to something else.
Yeah.
And so he made this trail. They said at the Warhol Foundation, while they're doing this catalog, they're finding so many things people have not even talked about or seen, because he just put them aside, maybe didn't even label them. So nobody's ever looked at them. They knew the ones that got fame or the ones that survived the one Dean carried them around, you know, or whatever. But yeah.
I just saw today, I mean, there's so much you can find now on the internet, and there's so many studies of Warhol just pouring out. But I read about one interview that he did around '66 when his films were being shown at underground film festivals, and somebody said to him, so, you know, you're supposedly giving up painting, and so I guess that means you think that film is the medium of the future. And he said, no, television's the medium of the future. And he did, you know, he desperately wanted to make it in film. I mean, his dream, I think, would have been to have Hollywood come to him. It never quite happened, and I think he was a bit disappointed, and he got over it. But, and he stopped making film, but he very quickly got into television when it made sense. And
again, there's thousands of hours of that.
Yeah, and he had his own show on MTV. So
in many ways, aesthetically, he predated everything we're all doing now with cell phones. I mean, the fact that it's a mass thing that we all do, it just came from Steve Jobs, not Andy. You know? when we were trying. Does anybody have any gut reactions to this? Because we're just going on and on. Not on and on, but yeah, it'd be nice to hear response.
Well, I
to,
had one question that I asked Bruce. I thought it would be interesting if someone would make a film of people watching this silent film with faces,
Yeah.
to see what the faces would be like who are other people watching it. And I was truly struck that nobody laughed until near the end.
I
when the
know.
black man
in the, yeah. Wasn't it astounding they could stay so still?
and
Yeah.
not see any
I mean,
humor in
somebody
it.
in the back said, when the film jumped, somebody said the film blinked before he did.
Was it Barbara Sterling? Was it Barbara Sterling? What's her name?
Brooke Haywood.
Brooke
came-
Barbara Sterling's back there.
Oh, that's a brain. That's a brain. All right. Anyway, Brooke Hayward. But she, being an actress, she was so good at not blinking and staying completely sober. It's just so interesting compared to some of the other amateur, just normal people.
Well, there are some people who both want Warhol to be very progressive, but also want to kind of criticize him in a way. So that there's some people who say, well, he was actually a monster to these people, and he was subjecting them, and he was using them in a way. I personally don't see that kind of cruel thing, but he obviously knows what he's going for, and in these early things he is saying, like, stay as still as you can. He knew that you would see them breathing and blinking, but it was this notion of making a still photograph that was not still, but it was a film that didn't move much either. So that was his goal initially, but he was also very quick to break his own rules. So by 1966, he's given up on you have to stay still. And so when he does things with Lou Reed, he has Lou Reed drinking Coke. He has people goofing around. There's an amazing one, my favorite, and you can see it it's a compilation that came out, I don't know, 8 years ago, called 13
Most Beautiful.
Yeah. They're screen tests, but it's that woman who was on the cover of the magazine with the flag and the crazy World's Fair glasses, Baby Jane Holsa. Her last screen test, she's basically using a toothbrush. And obviously she must have been really scrubbing hard, because it seems slowish when you're watching the screen test. And it's very funny because it's back to this kind of sexual thing, and there's a lot of oral fixation going on in a lot of these Warhol movies. And it's just very funny to see, but she's also happy, like the amazing 1960s blonde pop model, sexy woman brushing her teeth and smiling and being happy. And then at one point, she has to spit it out. So you see her turn away, and she's obviously spat on the floor, and then she comes back and she's absolutely like beaming, like, okay, I spat it out, and here I am again.
Yeah. During the same period, or even earlier, the one film you did mention that was made that was similar of ilk, of a long action going on, was the one that's called Blowjob. Which I think is a good
mention it in my, yes.
Yeah, but it's a good introduction moving into Couch, I think.
Yeah.
Because Couch, one of the reasons we showed it was, it is one I've always wanted to see, and since we sort of had carte blanche vis-a-vis The Hood, I said, this is it. Now we can watch this one. Well, it's probably also one of the more outrageous or explicit films of the group. But it is a progression off the screen test. And the more I think about it, I think they are the 3-minute rolls.
They
just
are.
extended. So, do you want to...
Get to it over there? Yeah.
Yeah, we got to fire that up so we can check while they're
Good.
So this is a good intro to go into the Couch film.
I like the portraits that had the light on both sides, that
Yeah.
had the line down the middle. It was like an ink blot, like a butterfly ink blot.
Exactly. And that's what I would say if I'd be making comments. It really is like a Rorschach. And
Rorschach.
He did do paintings that were inspired by Rorschach tests in the 1980s. So it's 20 years after. But clearly he's fascinated with this create symmetry and also making the shadow be like this amazing line.
I haven't seen that. I've seen the 13, that other thing, that the 13 portraits.
Yeah.
Most beautiful people, and they didn't have quite that quality.
Okay. So, please be advised that Andy Warhol's couch includes representations of carnal desire and an assortment of sexual acts. Thank you, Paulette, for helping us deliver that message.
We were going to bring bananas in tonight, but that got a little bit too radical.
I just
You'll know
wanna-
why in a few minutes.
So to segue into the second film, I want to talk about quickly Warhol's interest in transgression, partly because that's what modern artists are supposed to do, right? You're supposed to make it new. You get rid of the past and you do something that's original and different. But also, you have to make a space for yourself as an artist by doing that. And one of his most notorious in terms of just getting media attention was this film that he did called Blowjob. And what you see, it's very much like the movies that we've just seen. It's another headshot. All you see is this guy against this brick wall, and these are actually fairly untypical shots because most of the time his head is forward and you can barely see his eyes. So it's mostly a kind of a dark face, and you just see this face kind of moving and reacting, but you don't know to what, and you never see any sexual activity. But by just using the words blowjob, then you're immediately forced to imagine what is going on, and of course it was going on, but Warhol doesn't show it. So, so in all of these movies, I made a list of the kinds of things that he's doing because, as I said earlier, it's so easy to say he was just, trying to be clever and playing dumb, and they're really one-liners, these movies. But I think they're really rich. So he is looking at dramatic conflict, and he's playing around with how film works and how we see it. He's using words cleverly and getting attention with them. And he also is taking on the fact that there were prejudices and taboos, and of course sex was everywhere, but it was not a part of the official culture. And part of the beatnik movement and then the youth movement in the 60s was to sort of get more real about all of these things and to enjoy them because they're enjoyable. And so Warhol's doing all of these things in his movies. And I think it's important to remember always that even though they sometimes look kind of severe or they're sometimes seemingly boring, he's also doing that either to annoy you or because he thinks it's very funny to have something that's very boring thrown in. And here's one very quick transgressive thing that he experienced in the 1960s, in '64, which is why I focused on that year. It's the World's Fair, and the State Pavilion was that complex that you see there in the top left. And Philip Johnson, who was a contemporary art collector, an architect, knew Warhol and commissioned him to be one of about 12 people to make a mural decoration for that circular building that you see, which is called a theaterama. So you see 3 of the projects that were on the side of that building, including the one Eat by Robert Indiana. Warhol's idea was, because it was a New York State Pavilion and it was about celebrating New York, he came up with, someone had given him this police pamphlet, this handout about the 13 most wanted criminals in New York. So with his typical kind of offbeat, ironic sense of humor, he thought, okay, I'm going to make a mural of the 13 most wanted men. So he used these police images and turned them into paintings for the mural. So there's an example of one of the paintings. And that's what it looked like on the side of the building, the 13 most wanted. And that's another detail I'm showing you on the left. But guess what? People weren't too happy with the idea. So it didn't stay up very long. And Warhol was given a chance to redo something else. And then he quickly thought, oh, screw that. If you don't want it, I'm going to paint it over. So he did. He painted it silver. So for the duration of the fair being open to the public, Andy Warhol's mural was a blank silver object hanging on the side of this building. And couch. This is the couch that inspired the movie, and it's a couch that Warhol had. Supposedly one of the people found it on the street, and it's this big, wonderful, crazy, old, looks like velvet covered couch. And he is making this play with this movie on the notion of the casting couch, maybe the analyst's couch, but also like everybody's sofa where, you know, as teenagers you might dream of making out if your parents aren't in. So it's the couch as a world that also has, it can be an erotic world. So here he is photographed on his couch. These are snapshots made at the studio of young kids on the couch. I love the one at the top left. It looks really disgusting and scuzzy. Here's a picture of him doing one of those flower paintings, doing some finishing touches, and the kids sitting on the couch watching Andy work. And there's a view from the other direction. And this is a great photograph taken by Dennis Hopper, who was a pal and had been in one of Warhol's silent movies. And you see that the cast of characters really hanging out on the couch, falling into each other. And the guy who's holding a copy of Harper's Bazaar is playing with the straps on the stockings of the woman that's kind of hard to see. The other woman has got her thumb in her mouth, I think, and the newspaper seems to say, "I want a Yankee lover." And this whole thing of exploring sex and sexuality had been there. All of these things with Warhol, he's doing everything from the beginning. It just comes out in different ways. So he was exploring nudity and having fun with nudity and sexuality. On the left is a book that he did, which was, again, privately published, independently published, and he often used things like this as gifts to clients. But it was a book called In the Bottom of My Garden by Andy Warhol. And that was a line from a music hall song, "There are fairies in the bottom of my garden." So in a way, it was kind of like a clever, gay type joke. And you see it at the top, the fairies kind of acting out in various positions. And then Warhol did drawings. Things like this were never shown at the time in art galleries, but he was always getting young men to take their clothes off for him if he could. I love this quote that Warhol made in 1980, looking back on the 60s. And he says, "Most people thought the factory was a place where everybody had the same attitudes about everything. The truth was, we were all odds and ends misfits, somehow misfitting together." And I think that's what the movie you're about to see is. It's about a bunch of misfits who find themselves on the couch and they do things or don't do things together, or not. I think this is stills from the first reel. And this is a list of people that are actually in the movie. it's hard to know that there may well be more. Binghamton Birdie is in it. He's the guy that we saw 2 films of, and Rufus Thomas is in it. He's in the next to last reel that you see an image of there. And it was first screened in 1965, but it was not something that he showed often because because he could easily be raided and arrested for having made it.
No idea. Amy Taubman went back. The film critic went back to that era.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
There's Amy Taubman's a fantastic film critic who, as a young woman, went to the factory as part of like being a young kid in New York, and she was in a film, in a screen test, and you'll see her. She has dark hair and bangs. You'll see her on the couch.
She's one of the banana girls in the movie.
Yeah.
If you need that clue. Before you go on, it should be noted that previous to this underground cinema 1963, 64, 65 period in New York, I think we're showing a film in another program. At the end, we're showing a tribute to gay cinema masterpieces, and Enchanté d'Amour by John Genet was a film shown not in the same theater, one very close to it, by Jonas Mekas. And Jack Smith, the man who was on the couch with the woman's lingerie that Trevor pointed out, his film Flaming Creatures, and one more that I'm forgetting, which might be one of Andy's, were eventually raided by the police, and there was a whole trial about them being pornographic and this and that. But what that meant in the sense of film history is before that event occurred and the trials worked themselves out, everybody was acquitted ultimately, was that you had to be part of the system to show a movie. You couldn't just show a movie. You had to go and put it before a censor board, whether it was in New York or Pittsburgh or Los Angeles, and somebody had to approve it and then usually make cuts and whatnot. So a film like this could never be shown. So part of the word underground comes from the fact that these films being shown outside the system were not only volatile in subject matter, but against the law related to this censorship thing. The offshoot of the censorship trials, and Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising was part of this mess, was that then people could show whatever they wanted to. The whole sexploitation thing went crazy in films, and we have what we have today where anybody can basically do anything. But it was up this time period when those changes took place.
Yeah, and I'm going to end with this image, which is, this is a downtown publication, so a mimeographed. This was not something you would buy on the newsstands. This is just a bunch of folks, poets, hanging around in cafes, making their own mimeographed magazine. And it actually came out the month before that first screening. And knowing Andy, he probably wangled his way onto the cover as a way to promote this magazine. The magazine is called Fuck You, and the cover of this issue is a still from the movie we're about to see, and it was the mastermind of Fuck You magazine was this guy Ed Sanders, who was in Warhol movies too, and but things like this weren't about to get busted because they were kind of underground homemade zines at the time. But anyway, I love the fact that the reference to the cover illustration, it says Andy Warhol from his evil couch movie. So prepare for evil. Structurally, it's exactly the same as the, this is important, as the screen tests. They're those 3-minute loops that were then projected at a slightly slower speed, and he apparently made kind of these sexy situation type movies quite a bit, but they only apparently there were many more, but the only ones that survive are on this particular loop, and it's you can see Warhol beginning to explore narrative, so some of the loops follow, some sections follow one from another, but he also, in a typical Warhol manner, throws one of them out of sequence. So once the kind of sexual scenarios start happening, you're sort of into that and you're following along, and somebody's naked, and then 2 reels later, you see this thing where it's like, where that person starts taking their clothes off. So Warhol is deliberate, you know, in his selection of the sequence for the loops, he throws them off so that you're, you know, we all desperately want to turn everything into a narrative. We want to say what it means. We want to know where it's going. And one of the things he's doing as an artist is denying us that, but eventually getting there.
Thank you, Trevor.
Yeah.